Okay, come on.
Why is British music so awesome?
Why is British music so awesome? Well, I think what we did was, it's not. My friend, I'll go toe to toe with you on British music. We do. Well, I think the reason is we took something that was American and we repackaged it and sold it back to you. We took the blue. Shut the fuck up, sir. And genuinely, that's from the heart. We took sort of early blues and rock and roll records that came over with the GIs that helped us defeat the Nazis, and we got those records in port towns like Liverpool, and then we repackaged it and we sold it back to you. And that, in a sense, is what's happening this evening. I'm selling comedy to America, which is ironic, because stand-up comedy, when you think about it, I don't know if you take much national pride, but you should. There are 3 things America has given the world, artistically. You gave us jazz music, you gave us the Western, and you gave us stand-up comedy. And then all I did was go away and perfect it.
Well, yes, it's true, isn't it? British bands are awesome. British music is awesome. It's perhaps our greatest export around the world. Everybody has heard of the Beatles. They've heard of the Rolling Stones. You know, they've heard of Led Zeppelin. This music has travelled to every part of the globe. So I find it a little bit sad that Jimmy Carr wishes to then diminish that with this little comedy monologue here, because it's not the case that we knew nothing about rock and roll until we stole it off a bunch of GIs in the 1940s and 50s. That's not the history at all. This idea of cultural appropriation, that music belongs to certain identity groups, affects the way that we think of the history of music. On this video, I want to talk about the development of rock and roll and rock music here in the United Kingdom, but I want it to mirror what's actually going on in the United States of America. Rock and roll was not born in 1955 with Bill Haley and the Comets. This story goes way back before then, and it's a very interesting one to discover. Britain is not a particularly musical country.
What is your profession? God, a retired humorous dancer.
For the country that has invented so many things, our input into classical music is pretty negligible. The composers that have made great British music were often imported in from other countries. People like Handel would come in with their European classical music techniques and approaches and create great music. And I've often wondered why we never really created a great classical composer. Now, before the classical period, we had people like John Dowland, we had people like Thomas Tallis, but these were songsmiths and they told stories. The British tradition in music is a folk tradition. It's about storytelling, and often these stories could be very sad or they could be very funny. I have spoken at length on this channel about the English aesthetic, and for me the highest form of the English aesthetic is our humour, and our humour can be found in the very folk music that then turns into the music of music hall in the 19th century.
In a little town where I fellow, he's the leader of the village choir, and his voice is warm and mellow. He drives a fruit cart around the street, and everybody knows it. He doesn't sing or rave about his fruit, he simply blows it. Sing it all day long. It's better than any song. Though it isn't very pretty, you've got to admit it's cute. So all together let it go. It certainly comes to stay. Hear him say, hey, fruits in season plenty there is, apples, plums, and the old raspberries. Best today.
I think Jimmy Carr's wrong here about stand-up comedy as well. Stand-up comedy, like popular music, is an amalgamation of all sorts of different things. So before we get onto the history of popular music here in the UK, let's have a look at stand-up comedy. Now, yes, it's the case that stand-up comedy, in terms of someone standing up and delivering a monologue to an audience to make them laugh, has a very rich tradition in the United States of America. The guy that's seen as being the guy that invented stand-up comedy was a fellow called Charles Farrar Brown, who was a contemporary of Mark Twain. He was part of that set, and he created this sort of dumb, homespun sort of, everyman called Artemus Ward. Artemus Ward created articles that were published. Abraham Lincoln was a big fan of these monologues, but he would also go round and do these monologues in various locations, including the United Kingdom, which he visited just before he died in 1867 at the age of 32. He was originally buried here in the United Kingdom, which I find quite interesting. The Americans coming to get him in 1868 and take his body back to America. But the point is here that he and Mark Twain, to a certain extent, invent the idea of the light-hearted, homespun comedy monologue. This was made very, very popular in the 1930s in America by Will Rogers.
Now don't get scared and start turning off your radios. I'm not advertising or trying to sell you anything. If the mouthwash you're using is not the right kind and it tastes sort of like sheep dip, why, you just have to go right on using it. I can't advise any other kind at all.
But here in the United Kingdom, we didn't have the monologue. What we had was our funny folk songs that had morphed into the comedy songs of the music hall. And the music hall would often start with a comedy monologue that would run into the song. This idea of the novelty song, this idea of the popular song linked to humour, is a very British thing. Here's Charles Coburn, a veteran of the British music hall back in the 1930s, singing Two Lovely Black Eyes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to sing you a little song which I wrote and let loose upon the public about 50 years ago. It's called Two Lovely Black Eyes. Strolling so happy down Bethnal Green, this gay youth you might have seen, Tompkins and I with his girl between, oh, what a surprise. I chatted on politics frank and free, Tompkins got angry so sweet as him, all in the morning he handed to me two lovely black eyes, two lovely black eyes. Oh, what a surprise. Only for telling a man he was wrong, two lovely black eyes, oh yeah, two lovely black eyes. Oh, what a surprise. Only for telling a man he was wrong, two lovely black eyes. We'll have a cooler. Now I'll sing the chorus in French.
So we can see that the music hall is a very specific performance style, which of course imports its way into America, combining with a whole bunch of other traditions. For example, the minstrel show, which was a huge, probably the most popular performance form in the 19th century. And this then turns into vaudeville. Vaudeville, of course, originated in France and was another sort of light-hearted performance style, which had singing and acting and all sorts of different things. So we could see how the American stand-up comedy is growing out of a tradition that's coming from all over the world. Of course, this is what America is. America is a melting pot of multicultures, a unique circumstance where lots of different things can mix together. I think nowadays we have a tendency to try and pull these ideas apart and assign identity groups to the creation of these different art forms, when the truth is these art forms are always birthed out of integration. Integration is the engine that creates new ideas. And this is totally true with popular music. Popular music in the 19th century was basically folk music. you would go down to your local tavern and people would get up and sing songs. In the 19th century, we also saw the development of sheet music, so people could perform these songs at home. This was happening in both America and the United Kingdom and all across Europe. What's interesting in America is the development of jazz and blues. This is linked directly to the experience of the African American slaves. This is like an X factor that adds so much to American music to make it really unique and unlike any other music form. And also this style of music, which was based upon new rhythmical ideas and improvisation, was perfect for this new technology that had emerged at the end of the 19th century, which was recording. The recording industry is birthed in America, and the reason is because they have jazz and blues. But the blues that we listened to was actually an African-American appropriation of Irish and Scottish folk songs. Many of the famous blues spirituals that we can trace back to the mid-19th century actually have their roots as much in Irish and Scottish folk music as it does of the traditions that the African Americans had attempted to keep as they'd been ripped from their culture in Africa. Of course, the genius of African Americans is to bring something completely unique, but this unique thing is birthed out of a whole host of different influences, from classical music, Spanish music, Latin American music, Italian music, British folk music, African music, Native American music, in basically all the different music forms that exist in the different identity groups that are in America in its history leading up to perhaps the most important event in the history of popular music, which was the recording of the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. The original Dixieland Jazz Band was a white jazz group that had emerged out of New Orleans. It is often seen that they had sort of appropriated a black music form, but as I have shown elsewhere on this channel, I'm not sure whether that is the case. It's a mystery who the first jazz musician was. For many people, it's Buddy Bolden, the loud and charismatic cornet player that emerges at the end of the 19th century. His style had grown out of the spasm bands that existed in New Orleans in the 1890s. The spasm bands are a very interesting type of band, as though something had really revolutionary happened on the streets in New Orleans. We could easily say that the first jazz musician is Buddy Bolden, but we could also easily say that the first jazz musician was Emile Stalebread Charlie Lacombe. This was a street urchin, a child, a disabled child at that, who by the turn of the 20th century was blind, and with various cohorts that were children, he created a band called the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band. This band tried to ape the marching bands, the early ragtime bands that were operating in New Orleans, and they would busk on the streets creating their own instruments. They brought a ferocity of rhythm and improvisation into their styles, obviously not being able to read music, that caught on. And by the end of the 19th century, this band was very, very successful. Stalebread Charlie went to his grave believing that he had invented jazz. And in fact, it is written on his gravestone that he was an early inventor of jazz. I don't believe he was, but I think his story's interesting because of the things that he actually pioneered. In an interview conducted with Emile Lacombe, he told a story of becoming stranded in the town of Shreveport at the beginning of the 19th century. We went on the road, we got as far as Shreveport, and there the first jazz band in the world was stranded for the first time. We played on the 59 streets and passed the hat for enough for coffee and cakes and to get us to Jackson, Missouri. There we gave a show for the Elks there, and they gave us enough to get home. Doggone, but New Orleans looked good to us. This is interesting for me because one of the great musicians that had lived in Shreveport, although he'd moved out to Texas, was Leadbelly. Leadbelly is the musician discovered by Alan and John Lomax in the 1930s that seemed to show a window into this early murky history of American popular music. I find it very interesting that Leadbelly could have seen the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band on the streets of Shreveport, and he did return in the early part of the 20th century to perform there. What is interesting is the part that Leadbelly's going to play in the development of British rock and roll. If we look at the innovations of the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band and the quite apocryphal story that another band was booked in their place at a certain venue, and after people started complaining that it wasn't the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band, the owner decided to change the name of this band to the Razzie Dazzy Jazzy Band, that this could well be the beginning of the very name jazz. But what's interesting for me is it is the success of the recording made of the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917 that then goes on to sell hundreds of thousands of copies that really alerts the sort of capitalist inclinations of the burgeoning American recording industry to then go and search out jazz musicians. And this idea of the race records is born, and we have covered that on this channel. But also the original Dixieland Jazz Band ended up touring in the United Kingdom, and by the 1920s the United Kingdom had its own version of jazz going on. This is something that never really gets discussed. Simon Phillips, the great session drummer, legendary drummer, has been interviewed on this channel and has told the story of his father, Sid Phillips, who was one of the first British musicians to record jazz. Here's Simon telling that story.
Yeah. He formed his first band, the Melodians, I believe in 1925. So he probably was one of the first jazz bands in England at that time. I mean, in those days, if you were doing gigs, you're doing dances and stuff, you couldn't turn up to the gig unless you had a string quartet, because the violin and it was still part of the dance band collection of musicians. You had to have a string section, and he of course, his band was smaller. It was a jazz band, with Dixieland really. He must have been one of the first in England to do that.
This is when I just checked it out. I imagine he emerged after the war in that sort of trad jazz boom, but he was there way before then. And I found that very interesting, doing the channel and researching as I have into jazz. One of the things that hasn't been explored is the British jazz scene in the 1920s and 30s. Now, I did an interview with Martin Taylor recently, and he said to me that Stefan Grappelli told him that Django Reinhardt's biggest influence musically was George Chisholm,
who used to play with my dad.
Exactly. And so
fact,
I was shocked. I was shocked
with him.
With George Chisholm?
Yeah, because I was playing in the band from 69 to 73, and I started doing the broadcasts around 71, I think was my first, and the trombone players were either Don Lusher or George Chisholm.
By the 1940s, a number of musicians were looking back at the traditional jazz of New Orleans, and they were trying to recreate it as well as they possibly could. A number of musicians, including Humphrey Lyttelton, Chris Barber, Ken Collier, all were trying to imitate what they saw was the original jazz, because jazz changed dramatically at the end of the 1920s, moving from a sort of New Orleans frontline sound with a 2/4 rhythm to a much more swinging 4/4 rhythm that we hear in the bands of Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and a lot of the swing bands of the 1930s. This 4/4 rhythm really lays the groundworks of rock and roll. But here in the UK in the 1940s, there's this huge popular trad jazz boom. In the early 1950s, Chris Barber decided to take on a banjo player. Now, it's interesting that they wanted to have a banjo player in the band. If we look at the traditions that were birthed in the United Kingdom, in the music hall tradition, this then follows through to the superstars of the British music scene in the 1940s. Artists like, and this guy was probably the biggest of them all, George Formby. Let's have a look at George Formby performing in the 1940s.
The other day I got an invitation to go and join a nudist colony. And as the life was healthy and in the open air, I trotted off as happy as can be, with me granddad's flannelette night shirt. I walked up to the door. Someone said, now don't make a fuss, just take off your clothes and you'll be like us. Well, I was bashful, so I stayed by myself, for with the girls I didn't want to flirt. But when I was asleep, they all came and had to peep at me granddad's flannelette shirt. Lordy, lordy, me granddad's flannelette shirt.
Now, it's interesting that he is playing a ukulele banjo. And so we hear that sound, and we can hear in George Formby's music not only the comedy song of the music hall, but there are elements of jazz in this. It's swinging and it's funky, and you have that fast strumming that we associate with New Orleans jazz. We also hear him shouting the word "Oh Lordy," which is taken straight out of the sort of spirituals that had come through the United Kingdom in the 1920s and 1930s. George Formby was not just playing musical songs. There was a tradition there. And so the ukulele banjo that then became an instrument that many people start to learn to play on, myself included, has a certain influence here in the United Kingdom, which I think is different to the influence that musicians would have had in America. Of course, the Beatles were huge fans of George Formby, and George Harrison was a head of the George Formby Appreciation Society. So Chris Barber bringing in Lonnie Donegan to play banjo in the early 50s is almost like a no-brainer. The British people love that sound. The great jazzman Ken Collier had been stuck in New Orleans, actually in prison, I believe, on visa problems. He couldn't get back to the United Kingdom. When Ken Collier did arrive back, he went back and joined Chris Barber's band, and he came bringing all this knowledge and history from New Orleans. It was then that he turned around and suggested that they have a sort of jug band American folk section within the Chris Barber Ken Collier stage show, and Lonnie Donegan was put in charge of pulling this together. Now, this, I believe, is the unique aspect of British popular music that makes the band so awesome that emerged in the 1960s. Lonnie Donegan, as well as loving traditional jazz, had been influenced by a whole host of different musicians that had come out of America and been very popular all over the world. I would reduce these down to three musicians, and these three musicians are absolutely monumental in the history of popular music. The first would be Leadbelly, discovered by John and Alan Lomax in the 1930s. He came out of prison where he'd been serving his time for a murder, and basically brought a whole host of different American songs that went beyond just simple jazz and blues into all sorts of nursery rhymes, children's songs, spirituals, comedy songs. He seemed to embody all of this. He was a virtuoso guitar player and an incredible singer, and he transmitted these songs all over the world. He was befriended by a guy called Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody Guthrie was a white middle-class folk singer in America who took the songs of Leadbelly and added a political element to them, of course influencing Bob Dylan. And that line through Woody Guthrie really is the nuclear reactor of rock music. And when Dylan brings these ideas in the early 1960s, this idea of the protest song in America, of giving a voice to American youth, as Bob Dylan did, really is the impetus for rock and roll to become more serious and become rock music. But there's something different going on here in the UK. Lonnie Donegan was a huge fan of Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, but he was also a great fan of another contemporary of those two who was friends with them, and that is the great Joshua Daniel White.
Here's a blues about a man. Well, a train took his baby and left, and he's a very sad man. And he tries to give you the effect of a train happening and how you felt deep down inside. And the name of the song is Number 12 Train, and it goes something like this. Come closer, baby.
Who was an American singer, guitarist, and songwriter. He was also an actor and a civil rights activist. This guy in 1944 had the first million-selling single in America by a black gentleman, a black musician. He created a style of music that drew on what we could call the jug band, which is something that had originated in 1920s America. Now, the jug band is basically identical to what Emile Lacombe was doing with the Razzie Dazzie Spasm Band. And I have tried to research into this. Everybody who reports on this talks about the jug bands emerged in the 1920s. Now, the jug bands, again, was this sort of homemade music style with people, creating rhythms by blowing into jugs. They would also, use things like nose whistles and all sorts of homemade instruments. The reason why we probably go to these bands as being the first is because these were the first to record in the 1920s. Jug bands from Louisville, Kentucky were the first to record. And probably we could lay the claim for this to the violinist Clifford Hayes' Old Southern Jug Band, which was recorded as early as 1923. Whistler and his jug band, often making use of a nose whistle, first recorded in September 1924 for Jeanette Records. Earl McDonough's original Louisville Jug Band and Dixieland Jug Blowers were also among the first to record. The vaudeville blues singer Sarah Martin and the blue yodeler Jimmy Rogers both employed these bands for their recording. I think Lonnie Donegan had been asked to basically recreate those types of bands, but his influence that had informed him was from Joshua White. Now, it's worth mentioning another American artist that was influencing the trad jazz in the 1940s. Dan Burley started out his music career playing Chicago house rent parties, blues cafes, socials and other clubs. His barrel house playing has been said to have influenced Humphrey Lyttelton with his band Penny Blues. And anybody who listens to Humphrey Lyttelton's band Penny Blues will hear the scenes of Lady Madonna by the Beatles. So there's a line coming in that is before the advent of rock and roll in the 1950s. So with a washboard and a tea-chest bass and a cheap Spanish guitar, Lonnie Donegan played folk and blues, and he sung songs by Lead Belly and Woody Guthrie. This proved very, very popular, and in July 1954, he recorded a fast version of Lead Belly's Rock Island Line, featuring a washboard, but not a tea-chest bass. And on the B-side of that single was John Henry.
So I fooled you, I got pig iron, I got pig iron, I got pig iron. He said, tell you where I'm going, boy. He's going to tell her. Going down to Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road, yes indeed. Well, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a finally get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. Well, I may be right, I may be wrong. I know you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Down the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a finally get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line.
This proved a huge hit and predates rock and roll in America. He then went on to make the album An Englishman Sings American Folk Songs, which came out on the Mercury label. This skiffle boom predates rock and roll, and it informs rock and roll. musicians that got into this style found that they could create a band amongst their friends with virtually no money. As long as they could find an old classical guitar, a washboard, T-chest bass, they could start playing these songs. And these songs were fantastic. Lead Belly's songs were vital, exciting, they grooved. This was a really exciting time for music here in the United Kingdom. The musicians that decided to jump onto this style in the 1950s are the musicians that create rock music in the 1960s. Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, the Beatles, Roger Daltrey. All of these musicians started off in the skiffle craze. The skiffle craze contained a line back to American blues, to American folk, bypassing rock and roll slightly and supplying the genetic material required to make the jump over to blues. We can see that the popular music of the United Kingdom is holding its hands with American music, and there is communication going back between both of these styles of music all the way through. I find this a much better explanation as to why the British bands, when they went back to America in the 1960s, were so successful, because actually this was a much more complex assimilation and integration of styles than people think. The history of rock and roll in the United Kingdom is often belittled, but it also contains its own innovations, which was different to American rock and roll. In August 1956, Tony Crombie set up a rock and roll band. Now, Tony Crombie was a product not of the British trad jazz boom, but of the British modern jazz boom. Tony Crombie was a virtuoso jazz musician, as was his band. Tired of making no money, he decided to jump on this rock and roll craze in 1956, and he changed the name of his band to the Rockets. This band also contained the bassist Jet Harris that would go on to form the Shadows a few years later. The group was modelled after Bill Haley and the Comets and Freddie Bell and the Bellboys, but Tony Crombie's virtuosity meant that they could swing so hard, and they amped up the tempo with their tune Teach You to Rock, which was produced by Norrie Paramore and made the top 30 UK single chart in October 1956. October 1956, we have a different sounding, very British version of rock and roll. Now, it has to be said that many of our British rock and rollers were very derivative. And a whole other host of songs which have a certain guitar twang. This may have come out of Bert Weedon, who was a first British guitar hero, who was famous for his hit records in the late 1950s and his book A Tune a Day, which taught many guitarists, including Eric Clapton, how to play. So we now have this guitar heavy British sound, which we then get to hear in the Shadows. The Shadows, the session scene in London in the 1960s. Musicians could make a living by going and playing on the latest James Bond soundtrack. If we look at the musicians that played on Goldfinger, for example, it's a virtual who's who of musicians that are going to go on to create rock music a few years later. It's my belief that this history that I've just described, which is much more nuanced than we think, is why when eventually we got the Beatles, and the Beatles took those elements from George Formby, from the music hall, and took it back to America, they recognized something in there that was old but new, that they were aware of, but they also weren't aware of. And what I think it was the cheekiness. Britain had been in awe when Elvis Presley arrived on our shores in the late 1950s. This was like a being from another planet. But the same thing happened when the Beatles went to America in 1964. What the Beatles brought to America was this idea of the everyman, the regular guy, the person that would get up and tell you stories in the music hall over 100 years before. Normal stories of normal people doing normal stuff. Comedy, irreverence, surrealness. The Beatles brought all those things. And I believe that this was also in the DNA of American folk music. And their stand-up comedy was evidence of this tradition. And so the music that the Beatles took to America reminded the American people of something which they had sort of forgotten. And I think this is where the success comes from. There is an irreverence, there is a surreality to British music, which I find very endearing. In fact, one of the early rock and roll songs that I never mentioned was the tune from 1956, Blood Knocks Rock and Roll Call by the Goons. When we look at some of the early rock and roll stars in the United Kingdom, they are quite strange. Our first homegrown talent, Tommy Steele, had his first hit with the Cavemen in 1956. And of course, one of our first rock and roll stars who's been forgotten in the mist of times was Wee Willie Harris, who can only be described as strange.
Oh, ape, every time I see you smile, I'm a ding-dong thriller and I carry your cape and style. I'm gonna flip you on the head and love you all the while.
Of course, the Americans had the same tradition with artists like Screaming Jay Hawkins and later on Tiny Tim. This aspect of popular music, the aspect of novelty, I believe, is never focused on. People want to see the big ideas. They want to see the grand narrative playing out in these music forms, when actually a lot of the time what makes something popular is something silly and funny that normal people can grab onto. We saw that right at the beginning of this with the recording of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, whose livery stable blues was basically an ode to a farmyard, with the instruments mimicking the sound of various animals in the farmyard. This tradition goes all the way through popular music. It's something that we must remember is very, very powerful, and it's something that unites these two forms of music together. So I find it very interesting with Jimmy Carr making this claim and linking stand-up comedy and popular music together. Where he is wrong is to believe that America is the fountain of all these things and that the United Kingdom basically just appropriated it and threw it back. This is not the case, and actually the history is far more interesting than that.
Doing it all day long. It's better than any song. Though it isn't very pretty, you've got to admit it's cute. So all together, let it go.
Rock and rollers Eddie and Rick are keeping the spirit of rock and roll alive in their hometown of Ashford. Today they are raising their profile at the local shopping centre.
This is the biggest, best collection on 950 memorabilia at the start. Right.
Well, now 950 memorabilia display. You want more some memorabilia, you're going to get some rock and roll dancing. Thank you very much. You're more than welcome.
It's on in there. It goes on front to 1645.
We've lived in 950 since we on that high road, but we all love to be the chicken and we listen to this shit.
This roast chicken on like 1640, the Spanish Civil War.
I was just throwing some dog there.
Right below, on the floor.
Remember the 950 stuff? Yeah. You're still bringing nobody in 950, thank you very much.
It was real love now, it's always had spirit and all that stuff.
We got into the original Clark and built Haley right around, don't thank you very much.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock, all the way around that clock all night long.
All night long, 950 almost here.
Here we go, yeah.
What do you got that for, see?
Just a little Richie here. This is hell, little Richie. Woo! To the floor down, bro.
It's on the road, you're 950. Thank you very much.
He's rock and roll. Just rock and roll. Right. That's all rock and roll.
Just rock and roll, yeah. Just wait.
It's just rock and roll. These are rock and roll berries.
Shake one get shake for cocktail. Shaking cocktail. No, feel glug. Choke. I had something up in my chicken. Thank you very much. So chicken eaters. You someone want child chicken, not chicken, not chicken, not chicken. Thank you very much for chicken.
All the name is here. I love chicken very much.
Oh, go and sell them. Some CDs, man. I don't know. Just come to display them.
We just sold them all. It's 9:54.
Join Eddie and Rick next time when they enjoy a rock and roll picnic at the rear of the local social services department.
Oh.